Hi fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. I'm Marissa, and today I am here with my Victober-October reading wrap-up. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into the books. I am currently a bit sick, I am congested, and it is affecting my voice, so I apologize for any sniffling or sneezing that may ensue. Victober or October was not quite as prolific a reading month as I would have hoped for. I did finish 3 books and made some headway in 2 more, but I didn't get through everything I wanted to, which just means that Nonfiction November can really be a continuation of Victober, I suppose. The first book that I finished in Victober was Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope. I made a whole video on this, so you guys can take a look at that if you'd like to. It's about the relationship between a local country doctor, Dr. Thorne, his niece Mary, and their relationship with the Greshams of Greshambury. Frank Gresham must marry money to uphold his family's position and estate, but he's already head over heels in love with Mary, who is an orphan of modest means. And the book goes on from there. If you're wondering what Trollope's writing is like, or if the premise of this book sounds interesting to you, you should definitely take a look at that video that I mentioned. I'll link it up above for you, because I explore that in great detail there. The next book I finished was Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. I was so curious about this book because I had read Dracula and was intrigued by the concept of female vampires and LGBTQ subtext. This book predates Dracula, and you really have to wonder how familiar Bram Stoker was with this text. The book was a super fun read, very short as you can tell, and super gothic. This book is written in first person, narrated by Laura, who shares a curious incident that brings Carmilla, a stranger, into her home. Oddly enough, Carmilla looks exactly like a strange night visitor that she had seen in a nightmare when she was a child. It has so many standard Gothic tropes. It takes place in a foreign country. There is a found document, a letter in this case. There's a painting that looks coincidentally and eerily like a character we know. There's this ever-present solitary castle. It has a brooding tone to the book, and it's just such a glamorous and unsettling book. The prose is also very readable for a Victorian text, and I think those of you who are less familiar with Victorian works and really enjoy the mystery genre, the Gothic genre, or even horror would really like this book. So after I finished this one, I discovered that it was made into a web series on YouTube. It's such an interesting adaptation, actually. It takes place in a college, which, if you think about it, is a great venue for this type of a book. I've watched season 1 so far, but I think that there's definitely a season 2, and I've heard that there's a movie based on the web series released really recently. So I'll leave links to the web series in the description below for you to check out. I also read Lois the Witch by Elizabeth Gaskell this month. This is a historical fiction within historical fiction about Lois, the titular character, who recently orphaned, seeks her relatives in America, and she gets swept up in the Salem witch trials. It's really not my favorite Gaskell work because it's not Gaskell's usual writing style. She tries to mimic puritanical language and frequently uses phrases like pray thee and thou art and touch him not and take not his name on thy wicked lips. You get the idea, I am sure. I didn't really connect with any of the main characters, and it didn't exactly fill my witch craving that I tend to have in the month of October. Still, it was really interesting to see how similar or different Victorian viewpoints on the Salem witch trials were to how we see this event today. The book touches on how gendered the trials were, and the book led me to wonder, to what extent was the belief in witches real, and to what extent did it serve as a venue for revenge and a punishment for personal and petty problems and social prejudices? The novella hints at these sorts of topics and questions, but it doesn't do a great job at answering them or giving any sort of definitive conclusion. The book really put me in the mood, though, to read some nonfiction about the Salem witch trials. So I did some research, and The Devil's Snare by Beth Norton and A Storm of Witchcraft by Emerson W. Baker sound like a pretty good place to start with some Salem witch trials nonfiction reading. Plus, I have a book called The History of Witchcraft that I'd love to read at some point. And now for my unfinished books. I started Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy this month. I'm only about 50 pages in, which is disappointing, and I was absolutely loving it. But I stopped reading it for a bit to start the buddy read of The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. So I was reading this book, The Mill on the Floss, with Kate Howe, Katie from Books and Things, Ange from Beyond the Pages, and Lucy from Lucy the Reader. I'm over halfway through the book now, but I have to say I'm not loving it. George Eliot's writing is very dry, and it just doesn't have that same kind of wit and humor that Trollope or Dickens do. I find all of the characters irritating to read about. They're just not enjoyable. It centers on two characters, Maggie and Tom Tulliver, and their relationship. Maggie is a wild, free-spirited girl who loves books and adores and practically worships her brother Tom. As Maggie reaches adulthood, the clash between her family's expectations and her desires is painfully explored as she finds herself torn between her relationships with three different men in her life. Now, that sounds like a great premise, but this book isn't doing it for me so far. I do plan on finishing this one. I've been reading it on and off in audiobook and in the physical text, so hopefully I'll finish this one, and also Far from the Madding Crowd pretty shortly in the month of November. Now, there are some other books that I did not get around to reading, which I am sorely disappointed about. I was supposed to read Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell this month, and I just didn't get around to it. So I'm hoping to read this one in November, and I did not make any headway on Our Mutual Friend either, so I hope to catch up on that. Now, the end of this month was a little chaotic. Work in general was pretty chaotic this month, and Stranger Things came out. I was so excited about that. I made a Stranger Things cake for this premiere party that my friend was hosting, and you can check that out on Instagram. I have my Instagram linked down below, as I always do. It was a really, really fun party, and I spent that weekend binging Stranger Things instead of reading, unfortunately. So, yes. And then I got sick and haven't been reading much because of that. And then it was the end of the month. So, yes, that is where October went for me. But I hope you guys have had a spectacular Victober. I would love to hear about any of the books you read, Victorian or not, in the comments down below. And I just am curious to hear how your reading month was. I'm a bit behind in my BookTube watching at the moment, but I can't wait to check out all of the lovely Victober videos you guys have been posting and that I've been adding onto my Watch Later list. So look for some belated comments on those. And as always, I hope to see you in another video soon. Bye!
I am a vampire,